Welcome to By-The-Bywater, a podcast on the Megaphonic Network. I'm Ned Raggett.
I'm Oriana Schwint.
I'm Jared Pekacek.
And we're here to talk about all things J.R.R. Tolkien, his work, his inspirations and impact, creative interpretations in other media, languages, lore, rip-offs, parodies, anything we think is interesting. Thanks for joining us. Hello and welcome to the 64th episode of By-The-Bywater. It is great to be back with you all, and boy, when we recorded our last episode, we sort of hoped that there wouldn't be much news. So we will get to that momentarily. However, by the time you hear this episode, it is the month of greatness. It is the month of the publication of the West Passage. Yay, and all that. So, and we'll throw in links to show notes to various things that Jared will be doing or has already done. He has already made one podcast interview appearance. It's been released on the podcast The Sewers of Paris. We'll link that in, and there's more to come, right, Jared? Am I correct?
Yeah. One, I forget when it's going to be out, but we'll link to it, is with the Turn the Page podcast, which is the Syosset library on Long Island, which was a very fun interview to do. And then another one that I just did a couple days ago is with Dragonmount, and that one is actually, I think, on their YouTube channel, okay. or will be. It's not yet, but it will be. Yeah,
and more things besides. So it'll be great. We'll continue hyping them all up because why? Because it's well deserved. Darn it! And we've been doing it for a couple of years now, and we will keep doing it quite happily. Now, in terms of other future projects coming up, Oriana's got one to talk about, which we both agreed, and I both agreed. It's like, yes, please talk about it. So, Oriana, what's the story on your end with this project?
Yes, I will be brief. My husband and I co-wrote a horror movie together, and we are going to actually make it. We both have various other projects in development, but this is one that we are doing on our own. We are putting $50,000 of our own money towards shooting this feature. And that is, believe it or not, almost enough to do it. We wrote the movie very specifically. It's a haunted house movie to be able to shoot it with very few actors, one location. But we do need a little more money to kind of make it the movie it deserves to be. So we are doing a small Kickstarter of $15,000. That's our goal. If we got more, that would be amazing, but that's to help with post-production costs, and also working with SAG. AFTRA is a little bit more expensive than either of us anticipated, so but we want to work with union actors as much as possible, so that was important to us. So we will be launching the actually, by the time this comes out, the Kickstarter will be going. If you like haunted house movies, it's 3 adult siblings who inherit a house from their estranged father, and it's haunted. It's also it's a metaphor. It's so metaphorical. So if you like that kind of thing, check it out, y'all.
Well, as has been well known, people have never used horror movies as an entry-level thing to get their thing in the business, doing metaphorical tales on a limited budget to make something iconic. Never has happened, so I congratulate you on this thing. No,
and I have to say, the actors that we have are amazing. So great. I am so excited to really work with them.
This is wonderful. Well, we'll definitely hype that up, and you will see announcements and word from us, both in terms of show notes and things on our social media and stuff like that. So yes, there are great things happening beyond the world of this podcast, but we have to get to this podcast too, and we have to get to the news, as I mentioned, and my goodness, goodness, where to begin? Okay, well, Jared, the floor is yours.
It's been almost 2 months since we talked about any fresh news, and there's been a lot. We'll start with some specific publishing news. That's not mine, for once. You might remember that a couple of episodes back we mentioned there's a complete Tolkien poetry collection coming later this year. There's also going to be a new paperback edition of the one actual book of poetry he published while he was alive, The Adventures of Tom Bombadil. This is the same as the 2014 hardcover edition, edited by Wayne Hammond and Christina Scull, with various drafts, story fragments, and more, as well as the main text, and will be released on August 20th. But all the other news is about various Tolkien adaptations, seemingly all of them. First, the team behind Warner Brothers' The War of the Rohirrim anime adaptation did another visit to the annual Annecy Animation Festival in France after an initial one last year. This time around, footage was screened and some official art has also now been released. Peter Jackson and Fran Walsh have also been now publicly mentioned as executive producers. Philippa Boyens had already been listed as a primary producer. There's a fair amount of reports and interviews floating around about this, and we'll link them in the show notes. Meantime, an initial trailer for the second season of The Rings of Power has been released, and okay. Oh, God. We will talk a little bit more about this in a second, but it's amusing how much of a clear sense of, we know the first season was a mess, we tried to fix it, is going on with it, but color us extremely dubious on this front, obviously, for a lot of reasons, not least of which is the revelation that Tom Bombadil is in fact going to be in this season as well, and... hold that thought. If all this wasn't enough, it turns out that there's also a new Warner Brothers live-action film in the works, and like The War of the Rohirrim, it is a standalone prequel in the larger Peter Jackson continuity, and will be produced by the Jackson Walsh Boyens team in turn, but it's going to be directed by Andy Serkis, who also stars in it because the official title is, I don't do like a drum roll, The Hunt for Gollum, presumably about how Aragorn tracked him down and captured him in the years before Lord of the Rings, and it's supposed to be coming out in 2026, so like we said, that's a lot. We're already a little tired.
I am just wiped by all this. I have reached the point, honestly, and nothing against some of the stuff. I mean, as I mentioned, I know somebody who's very heavily working on the War of the Rohirrim, but I have reached the point of we really don't need any more, do we?
Yeah,
no,
it's just oversaturation.
And if you had told me this 40 years ago, when I would have killed for any level of this, now I'm like.
It's the sort of the Star Warsification of Lord of the Rings. I've seen people refer to it as like the MCUification, but I don't think that's accurate. I think it's more like Star Wars, where you're like, oh my God, for so long I have wanted so much. And then all of a sudden you get too much. And it's been, especially with Rings of Power, it's been bad.
Yeah, and it's also the fact that it's a split between various, interests too going on here and various regimes. I mean, even these two Warner Brothers things were not really done in concert. One was done pre-Zaslav, and the other one is post. And they're sort of just continuing on, even if we do have like Jackson et al. With working behind the scenes. But then you throw in another competing entity doing its own thing, and it's just like I hate to pay. It is too much. Having said that, I suppose we need to break all these things down. Okay, so let's start with the least promising thing first, since we've already had a chance to see it. Yeah, that Rings of Power trailer. So is the idea that Sauron wears a blonde wig now and no one knows who he is? That is Clark Kent Superman level of, gee, if I wear glasses, no one will recognize me. Is that what's meant to be going on?
So this is such redoing that Anatar plotline that kind of happened already, because they like you said, it looks like we know it was a mess, we got to fix it, we're going to do that over, but try to do it better this time. Like, why not do it right the first time and not have to anyway?
No, they needed that first season to set up everything.
Did they simply not intend at all for any rings to be forged in the first season, but then they got the note that like, what? No, it's called the Rings of Power. You have to have some of them. And they were like, well, shit. Okay, I guess we'll do this. I don't know, man. Tom Bombadil?
And the Tom Bombadil thing.
Kinnear is Tom Bombadil.
Is fine, And we
I like him as an actor. I think he's great.
Yeah.
I mean, we got Kieran Hinds, we got we got some good actors coming up with the season, but these results. And we should emphasize to people, too, if you haven't seen the news, the Tom Bombadil thing is not a joke. They have specifically released photos of the set, of the scenes and all that, so this is happening.
And he doesn't even have the yellow boots.
Yeah.
Yeah, where is Goldberry? No Goldberry, no sale. Sorry. Tom Bombadil is a wife guy. That is his whole thing.
My theory that I'm sure is going to be correct, and I hope is proven wrong, is that because the writers are so committed to the stupid mystery box thing, Goldberry is the mystery box for Tom Bombadil, and it's going to be like, obviously mishandled. I don't know how they're going to do it, but that's his awful mystery box thing that's going to happen, is meeting Goldberry. Or finding her, because she's been lost or something like that.
Gentle listeners, because we're just an audio-only podcast, you did not see my nostrils flare and my eyes widen when Jared said that just now. But Thank you for nothing, even though I'm sure you're right. God damn it.
So,
we should also add that apparently the setting of Tom Bombadil is not going to be where the Shire is or nearby. It's supposed to be somewhere out in Rune, somewhere in the Far East or whatever. So
famously, he moves around.
Yeah.
All over the world.
And there were some interesting bits in that trailer. Like, it looks like Moria is about to start falling apart really quickly. Hey, again, the timeline is clearly up a creek at this point, but, okay, spectacle. But everything else, yeah.
It's
sure,
so funny
great.
because the Tom Bombadil stuff, they did this with the first season too, where they keep demonstrating an actual knowledge of what is supposed to be, like, what the meaning is of these things. Like, Tom Bombadil represents, like, kind of the spirit of nature in a way, of the English countryside specifically, and that kind of, like, they know all that, they get that, they just don't know how to turn that into storytelling, and then they fall back on the horrible, again, mystery box type stuff. Like, why?
I don't think we saw any ants in the trailer, but I wouldn't be surprised if they show up this season too. Great,
Yeah.
wonderful.
Sure.
Yeah, lovely.
I feel so defeated somehow just knowing this is coming. Like, they didn't cancel it. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, obviously they wouldn't have, but...
I like how House of the Dragon, having, like, clearly kicked its butt 2 years ago when they were up against each other, now is just off in June doing something like, haha, we know people want to watch us. They're just loving every minute of it. Anyway, so shifting to the other two things so we can get to the main topic. So, yes, this Hunt for Gollum film.
No, thank you.
I personally love using every part of the animal in my cooking.
Gollum tail soup.
I admire the impulse. But what?
Yeah.
I don't even know.
It seems like a major bone being thrown to circus, which, sure. I mean, okay, it's his most iconic character. It will be the lead of his obit when he dies. I mean, we all know this by now. And he's turned himself into a competent enough director of doing, CGI-heavy spectacles. He did, he's done one of those Venom films and da-da-da-da.
That's right. That's right. I forgot. I keep forgetting that he did the last Venom. Oh, my gosh.
He did do the last Venom film. I don't think he did the new one. But, yeah, so it's one of those things that, it's like, okay, fine. And, yes, is it something from the appendices and some of the background thing that this actually happened? Yeah, fine. Do we need the details? No. At
we
least,
don't. This is the kind of thing, this I think will kind of feed into what we talk about later, but I don't think I would mind if I could be sure that all of this stuff, and this is why I'm a little more excited about War of the Rohirrim in some ways, is if it was a different thing. But it's not going to be, because it's still in the Jackson continuity. We're going to have the same stuff that we already had, and it's not going to be trying to do anything different. If I'm wrong about that, I will be so happy to be wrong about that. But I don't think I am. Like, it's going to do a lot of the same stuff, I think, that, like, The Hobbit did, where there's not enough there that you end up padding it out with ludicrous action sequences or whatever. But it could, like, I'm not saying it should be this, but even like a Terrence Malick version of, like, The Hunt for Gollum, where we're just kind of like,
okay, now my eyes are widening in excitement. I would want this.
Yes, though. Yes.
Like, it wouldn't be very tense, I'm sure, but, like, we already know he's going to catch Gollum. Like, we don't, if it were a different thing.
Richard Linklater version.
Yeah.
Film it across 20 years. Show Gollum aging.
Yeah.
Before the Misty Mountains.
I want a different vision, and I don't think I'm going to get it. So
it is weird to realize that this will be the first live-action film not directed by Jackson that actually seems to be happening, unless something bizarre happens again. We have a Del Toro situation reoccur, but I suspect that will not be the case, partially because it is just one film. Well, at least I hope it's one film. Good Lord, imagine if they try and break it into two. Why did I say that? Oh, no.
Oh, no.
Assume the worst. It will probably happen in this case. Okay,
they broke it into 3 parts based on, like, regions. Like, this is the Hunt for Gollum near the river. This is the Hunt for Gollum over here. This is the Hunt for Gollum that takes place in Mirkwood, where he finally gets imprisoned with the Wood Elves.
I'm in vain. Also, this movie's supposed to go out in 2 years' time.
Sure.
Okay. So it
That's tough.
Doesn't Cameron have all those studios locked up for all his Avatar movies? I thought that was the whole idea, that he took over Jackson's little setup down there to do all that. Yeah, who can say?
Maybe they will just be chasing around in a field with the camera like a Terrence Malick movie. You could do it that.
Gollum in a field in England.
Look, if they need tips on budget filmmaking, I have some.
We got connections there.
Guerrilla filmmaking.
Indeed. Well, the one last bit of news to get back to is the one that actually is definitely, happening and, we're a little more interesting here is the War of the Rohirrim stuff. We finally have some art. We finally have reports of the initial footage. We've got some initial interviews, things like that. Again, I don't know if it's answered all our, potential concerns and things that we brought up in our Rohirrim episode just a couple of months ago. But at least we kind of know what we're going to get now. It looks like a Lord of the Rings anime. I mean,
yeah, it looks like
characters.
Castlevania, which makes sense. It's the same studio or something like that.
Yeah,
or there's some creative DNA shared.
Yeah, I forget what the deal is. But yeah, I mean, okay. They've only officially released 3 images so far. We get, I think the royal family, essentially, with our what is it with straight men and red hair character there.
Come on, man. Come on, guys.
There you go. And she's got a big sword, too.
Amazing.
Even hotter.
Yep. And that's how you know. And then our wolf guy going like, and all that. And then, and then she's drawing the sword, and there are these weird subhuman things back on. Are they subhuman? I guess we'll find out. So, it's 6 months to go, but it is happening. We've at least seen some of this. Still no trailer as yet. So we will see. But
Ned, this is your Moby Dick. The War of the Rohirrim trailer
the trailer will never appear. It'll be
you
like
are just
the movie will just come
pursuing.
out. Yeah. Clearly, I'm just hoping against hope. It's like, give us something. So anyway, well, sometime soonish. Presumably. So, okay. So, that's a lot of stuff. And that little Tom Bombadil news about the book coming out. Yeah. So it was something that initially we thought it was going to be a new edition, but it is not. It is just the paperback of the 2014 edition. And this is smart because, again, that complete poetry thing is like 3 volumes on $150. I'm like, yeah, okay, this is the smart idea. Make this available as well. So if people want that little taste of it, you can do that. That's probably a smart thing. I think, Jared, you were the one who mentioned that because we're getting Tom Bombadil in the series, maybe that's another reason why it's getting a new publication too. So who can say?
Yeah.
Bleh. More on all that later as the years goes on, because we'll be hearing more. But there is other stuff to talk about, and we do have the most major thing. Hey, we've been celebrating it. It is indeed the publication of the West Passage. Yeah. That is what is prompted this episode, because Jared is not writing a knockoff Lord of the Rings, unlike a certain guy named Terry Brooks. So and that led to thoughts about how we can talk about Tolkien in a slightly different light with respect of other people looking at it. And that leads to my choice of topic. It is mine, so I will begin. Talking about resisting Tolkien may seem negative or derogatory, but as was mentioned in the preview in the last episode, there is a distinction to draw here. We're not talking about intemperate dismissals along the lines of Edmund Wilson's famed slam of The Lord of the Rings around the time of its publication, with the title, "Ooh, those awful orcs," which to my own mind is a classic case of a, privileged prep school snob absolutely not getting the fact that just maybe, possibly, perhaps there was another way to write a story that appealed deeply to people other than modernism in the vein of his literary pals that he hung perhaps a little too leech-like on even after they were dead. But I digress. We'll link his Wikipedia page. You decide. That said, in one way, Wilson's generally leftist point of view has had understandable after-echoes in other senses when it came to writers who inevitably followed in Tolkien's wake after his rise in popularity, and as he moved from being a living contemporary into being a bit of a figure on a pedestal. Essentially, if not ever in a concerted sense, a number of authors have openly or contextually responded to Tolkien with a form of resistance, looking to create and critique fantastic literature beyond simply following the path he laid down, or working in the general assumptions that often been projected on his work in turn. This kind of resistance takes many forms, and sometimes evolves with time. A good example may be found in the work of someone who was involved in one of the key efforts of posthumous Tolkien publishing. Guy Gavriel Kay was Christopher Tolkien's assistant in the preparation of the Silmarillion, as specifically credited by him in his introduction. When Kay began his own authorial career, he did so with the 1980s trilogy The Fionavar Tapestry, a kind of fusion of various fantasy styles, some far more overtly adult and earthian elements than Tolkien's, but hewing to what had become the post-Tolkien fantasy model of 3 books with a fight against a dark lord hidden in a remote fortress at the core of its plot. But his subsequent book, Tagana, besides establishing what has since become his preferred settings of semi-alternate Earths, also blew up this model in favor of living fully in a portrayal of gray-shaded characters in a heightened setting, where there were certainly protagonists and antagonists, but only rarely outright heroes and villains. There's much more that can be said, but it almost functions as a recognition that there's simply more than one way to approach things in what can be termed fantasy as a whole, rather than simply rewriting The Lord of the Rings once again. Sometimes this kind of resistance is more specifically socio-political, and is laid out directly in writings and essays by authors. When it comes to Tolkien's own fellow UK writers, perhaps most famed essay in this vein appeared a few years after his death, 1978's Epic Pooh, as in Winnie the, written by Michael Moorcock, whose own involved, sometimes forced, but also sometimes astonishing interwoven cycles of novels across genre was already well established. Moorcock himself is a self-described anarchist, a position that notably Tolkien had earlier applied to himself in turn. But Epic Pooh makes the case that Tolkien's own approach, as well as writers like C.S. Lewis and Richard Adams, is fundamentally small-c conservative, rooted in Merry England stereotypes and Anglican Toryism regardless of exact religious belief, a creativity ultimately based in comfort rather than explicit confrontation. In more recent years, China Melville has more explicitly written on Tolkien in similar veins, but from his own more specifically hard-left political perspective, both acknowledging Tolkien's creative strengths, but still identifying areas and themes he finds worth reacting to or undermining, which he's clearly aimed for in most of his own work. In American terms, Ursula K. Le Guin brought a perspective via both her work and her famed essay From Elfland to Poughkeepsie, which sought to consider Tolkien's role in part of a larger series of approaches to fantasy, though not necessarily in a dismissive fashion. But easily the most well-known author in recent years, identifying a self-distinction from Tolkien, is also the most famous one in the field lately, George R.R. Martin. He's by no means anywhere near as negative as Moorcock or Melville, but he has famously compared his approach with the Song of Ice and Fire books, and all that has resulted from it, to Tolkien with the catchy line about wondering what exactly Aragorn's tax policy was as a ruling king. As such, the idea that Martin's work is seen to be more specifically adult or quote-unquote real in comparison to Tolkien has become its own form of truism, however understandable. Separately, the Black American author N.K. Jemisin and the Black Caribbean American authors David Anthony Durham, himself something of a Martin protege, and Marlon James, to name just three authors among many, have identified their own fantasy work as being in partial response to Tolkien and his own Eurocentric perspectives, his blind spots or too easily stereotypical language or descriptions, while, like George R. R. Martin, fully acknowledging the connections and potential debts. Marlon James's own Tolkien lecture from 2019, which we'll link in the show notes, is well worth a listen. There are many other newer authors in recent years who now work an increasingly broader perception of what fantasy is or can be, and as such, the chance to resist Tolkien has grown with it, even as his work has remained widely popular and easily referred to as what fantasy is or can be, something that all the numerous adaptations from Peter Jackson and beyond, as we've just talked about, have made even more clear. The resistance can be stylistic, thematic, even down to the basic nuts and bolts of what storytelling is or can be, or the assumptions of what a fantasy setting is supposed to have to meet a preset expectation of the field. So with that in mind, talking with a newly published author who himself has had the chance to think on this more thoroughly than most in these recent years, seems like the best approach. And that's our co-host Jared here. Maybe it's time to ask him a question to start this discussion. So, kicking this all off, I remember in our introductory episode all that time ago, you talked about, just your obsessive time with Tolkien, going like, just things like that on the first encountering. And so when it came, and you've, I think, hinted at this in some of the recent pieces, so let me just throw this out at you. Is it a question of conscious things, like going like, I'm not going to go down the Tolkien road, or is it more a matter of, I see what's out there and I don't want to be caught up in these kind of mistakes that people are making when they're trying to do their own version of a fantasy in a Tolkien line? Or is it something so simplistic? Can it be summed up easily that way?
It was kind of unconscious when I wrote, but with the other stuff that I've written that hasn't been published too. It's not so much like I'm not trying to avoid Tolkien-esque tropes. It's more like it's not a conscious process. It's more like, well, this is what this story requires, is this kind of thing going on. And I feel like probably a lot of authors in my generation are kind of following that same path, where they're not sitting there going, okay, I've got to respond to this, because they don't see it as necessarily having any interest or value to be like, I'm going to deconstruct the fantasy world. Like that's a very maybe early 90s 80s position of like, well, we've gone too far down this road, it's time to pull back. We're just on a different road entirely. Somebody like Moorcock or Martin is definitely in that place of responding to Tolkien, but now that they've done it, we don't have to. So even though like I love Tolkien, it was like he already did all of this stuff. I don't have to repeat it. I don't have to pull a Brooks and be like, well, I'm going to do my own version because my interests are different. Despite loving Tolkien, it's the kind of stuff that I want to put into a story is just different. And it's not even like, what was that Terry Pratchett quote where he was like, Tolkien is like Mount Fuji in Japanese print. He's either in the background or you're standing on him. In a sense, I'm standing on him, but I'm also like, I'm not even in Japan. I'm in a different country entirely. Like,
to extend the metaphor, so
yeah,
I could follow up from there. But Oriana, do you want to ask a question, or just for Jared about all this, or things like that?
Or do you want to talk?
Yeah.
No. Ask Jared more questions, Ned.
All right.
Ask him more questions.
Maybe I can sort of throw it open, sort of a general thing that we can all sort of like, talk about from there. So, I think all three of us, I could be wrong, especially after whenever we first read Lord of the Rings. And again, we all collectively read it at our respective ages. We were all like, 12, 13, I seem to recall us talking about as sort of that thing. And one of the things we did was tend to look for, it's like, oh, what else is out there? And encountering this sort of similar problem. Although, again, my perspective, encountering it, doing this in the early 80s versus you guys, end of the 90s, early 2000s, obviously, there was a lot different fields out there in terms of what I could reach for. I was more obviously swimming in the post-Tolkien fantasy fallout. You guys had slightly different options, and also you're also in the, bluntly put, the Harry Potter world too, because that was also happening hugely at that time as well. So the perspectives were different regardless in terms of what was expected of fantasy. I think building on your point there, Jared, kind of what I see as sort of like one reason I can sort of see is, I could say, resistance to it, and you've hinted at this, and I don't want to be leading you out and describing what you're doing with your novel, is the idea that instead of being something that's so presented so thoroughly as a feigned history with its appendices and its backgrounds, and you can trace all the years and you're knowing this all here, is something that this is less important. It's more like, okay, you can have a little backstory as a treat, and then it might not even be the backstory, but it's something that you're not. It seems like there are people who are not necessarily having to sort of justify all this in turn. I mean, this is sort of reaching back to another example, but it kind of reminds me of Mervyn Peake and Gormenghast, in that Gormenghast just is. There's no exact history of what Gormenghast, how it came to be, and all that. There's no point in a Gormenghast prequel. There never would be. So.
No. Let's see the foundation of the castle. I'm definitely intentionally existing more in the Gormenghast type space. It's extremely obvious in the fact that the setting itself is a giant old crumbling palace. Like, it's very similar to Gormenghast in that way. Mm-hmm. But also, what interests me about an invented world like this, when it comes to my making one, gets more into like, well, how do people in the world feel about all of this? So there is, I read a review of the book a little while ago that was like, they've all been glowing otherwise. This one was a little lukewarm, and it was the one I was afraid I was going to get from everybody, which was like, it's more interested in the world than in the characters, because there is a ton of world building happening, and there are a lot of people like reading old texts about the world and that kind of thing, but it's not appendices. It's like they're trying to figure out what's going on, and there's stuff that's presented to the reader but not to the characters, so you have maybe a more complete picture, but you don't actually know that much. And these things are all kind of arising from within. They're things that ancient scholars have written or whatever, because I'm not interested as a creator in giving all of these dates and giving this huge overview of what's happening. It's much more granular and centered on what these characters know or could encounter but don't, and therefore learn. It's actually the biggest influence on the way the story is told is actually Moby Dick, where there's like all of those chapters about whales that like aren't part of the plot, but have a lot to do with the mood of like Ishmael trying to understand the world that he's in. Mm-hmm. And when you finally encounter the whale, it doesn't matter what you know about whales. And that's the West Passage in a lot of ways.
We'll keep that in mind when giving it a read. So, or I will continue on unless, or if you want to jump in at any point, I will continue on. So from here, there's things like that. So we're not trying to shut you out. Maybe let's expand this a bit here. So you pointed out, about, I think rightly, the idea that your generation, broadly defined, has
us young people.
You youngins, you people who are only in your 30s, who have essentially a broader palette to work with, because there's a broader expectation of what fantasy is or can be, especially across different forms of media, as we all know. One thing I especially appreciated about Marlon James's lecture is that he said himself that his way into this literature was really, when he was growing up, was comic books. The idea of these fantastic forces playing around there. It's sort of like only after that did he really come into learning more about, like, what Tolkien did and all that, and I thought that was like, okay, yeah, that's accurate, and that strikes me, especially in this modern mediascape, for lack of a better word, where you can have now huge amounts of fantastic, whether it's fantastic movies or just superhero movies, which are by default fantastic creations and things like in different ways, however much the trappings may be on them are out there. So with this in mind, I guess it's not so much a question, more than a comment, but is there?
Oh my God!
Giving you your first.
I better get used to it now.
Yep. Maybe let me throw this out there as sort of a way that is more of a leading question. Do you feel that there is even, I don't want to say even a point to writing something in Tolkien's specific vein, where you have an incarnate figure of evil who is on Earth, however removed, and things like this? Do you think there's a space for that, or is that something that's more like, within the realm of what can be called, let's say, more specifically religious apologetics, for where it's seen to be more incredibly important than in this more secular world that we're in now by default?
I think there's a space for it, but where I see it working more, ironically, maybe it's not ironic, I don't know. I'm tired. It's been a month for me. I don't see it working as well in fantasy with this kind of invented world. Where I've seen it and been blown away by it is in actually Twin Peaks or other David Lynch movies, where he always, not always, but he often has a figure of just like concentrated evil, but it's doing something very different from a fantasy novel. And it's not to say you can't do it in fantasy, but I feel like we've gotten to a point where it's just played out. We don't need to do it anymore. There are more interesting things you can do with this. Like you brought up Guy Gabriel Kay in the introduction, and like his two Sorantium books have they're fantasy, but there's no incarnation of evil. It's much more concerned with like imperial politics and religion.
Right.
Which is not to say that that's the only model that we have. I don't do that with my book, but there are just other ways you can explore conflict that don't rely on a personification of evil. But you can if you want.
And I'm also thinking
do what makes you happy.
Yeah, there you go. And I'm also thinking about books like R.L. King's, The Poppy War and other things like that, where we're also looking at more younger writers coming in. And I also forget the name. She is I believe it's an Indian background. I forget her series, but there are many other things coming out where they're explicitly non-Eurocentric epic fantasies. And we've talked about this before, but I think something like that is kind of good, because there is, I don't want to say it removes the idea of this particular duality that is, very much centered in Lord of the Rings. For all that there are shades of gray, there is still the idea of it's like, bad. Let's, things like that. Whereas these things allow for different, because the historical and philosophical backgrounds being drawn on are different. So as a result, you're not getting quite that particular way of doing things, although there are equivalents and analogs, and I would defer to others to be able to talk about them more expertly. Let me ask a question to Oriana, if you don't mind.
What? No.
You get to play in this sandbox too.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. You talked about yourself once. This is a long time ago, about how your own initial thing about doing some fantasy when you were still a teenager and fully like this is early work. You left behind. Yeah. That you sort of like was knocking off David Eddings, who of course was one of the ones who followed and things like that. So obviously you work in different fields and different things like that. Have you ever thought about going back to a fantastic mode, or is it one of those things sort of like I need a better framework than just simply doing what I was doing beforehand? Or how would you frame it to yourself, if it even is a possibility or a thing you're thinking about?
No, it is. I actually would very much like to write for a fantasy TV series. I would like to create one. This is a pilot that I wrote, and I don't think I'm the right person to do this as a show. I mostly wrote it as a sample just to show people what I can do, but it is the Irish pirate queen, and it's sort of an alternate history with a supernatural element where she gives one of her children to the Fae in order to get their help in ridding Ireland of the English. And, I don't think I'm the right person to write that show. I think probably an Irish person should. But it was just, I just had this idea and I was, really captivated by it. And, that is very rooted in Tolkien and the Celtic influence that is very much, throughout. Tolkien and to an extent, The Once and Future King, which was extremely influential on me, and the Orkney Island parts in particular.
Oh God,
I just latched on to that, so I would love to adapt that into. How has that not happened yet?
It deserves it.
Could be really something special if any executive. Maybe I'll bring that up in a meeting or something.
Yeah.
It's less for me about resisting Tolkien and more just appreciating that he opened the door, right? The dude was not consciously trying to create a genre or anything like that. It's up to us to decide how we view his influence, and we get to do things like Jared, and we don't have to consciously resist or say, well, yeah, we're going to do things different. It's just, I'm walking through this door and here's, because we can imagine anything and find that very beautiful. I'm grateful that door was open. But yeah, I do think of it only as an open door and nothing more at this point.
Mm-hmm. I think the biggest way that Tolkien has influenced the way I write is what he did was take these things that he was passionate about and provide a fictional framework for them to exist in. Whereas other people have been passionate about Tolkien,
right?
Rather than bringing outside. Not that they don't, because you're still your own person. You're still bringing other interests in, even Terry Brooks.
Of course.
But for me, it was I care a lot about art history. So the West Passage, in a lot of ways, is a trip through a cursed art museum. Because I care about that, and I care about horror and the way it intersects with religion. This will make sense when you read it.
And you will read it, everyone.
And you will read it. And so, that is in there. But without being, a Tolkien-esque fantasy. I'm not trying to imitate him, because what I learned from him, the way I'm imitating him, was, what do I love? How do I want to turn that into a story? And then I did.
It's interesting to me how, in a way, I don't think it's come back around to this, keep in mind, but in a way, I think we're seeing now this idea that Tolkien provided such a particular distillation point and also had the advantage of, high-level publication, the, groundwork laid with the success of The Hobbit, the cycle that went from there, the post-World War II popularity, etc., and prosperity, honestly, and many other factors besides, that a lot of what we called fantasy literature beforehand, which has can have a much different tone depending, is the type of thing that almost seems to be more grasped onto now by various people. This is slightly reductive in terms of we're usually talking about a bunch of authors who are a bunch of, like Tolkien, hey, bunch of European white guys, one way or another, European in background. But I'm thinking of people like, not so much E.R. Edison, that's its own thing. I'm thinking of people like, and not even Robert Howard, although, but I'm thinking more like Fritz Lieber. Yeah. I'm also thinking like Jack Vance to an extent. There are other ones, of course, I can name, that's just simply scraping the surface, where they're not really so much interested. Lord Dunsany, another good example, where they're not interested in such strict binaries. There isn't the idea that there is a dark lord that you have to fight against. It's more nuanced. I always thought one of the more interesting ones that happened that allowed for that, which appeared kind of right in the wake of Tolkien, but was very much, he was on his own tip, was Lloyd Alexander in the Prydain books. You have Anwin the god, the sort of like the Sauron equivalent, for lack of a better term, but it's rooted, of course, in Welsh myth and serves a different function, and he's a much different character, and he's also, I think, more cryptic and interesting for that reason. He really has his own strange motivations Americans, is the best way to put it. And I like how we don't get his full story, and I don't think we ever will. I think that's actually part of the reason why that might have been my second favorite one of that when I was reading a whole bunch of things in the early 80s. Sort of like that might have been my second favorite one after the big guy. It also occurred to me that the most successful American avatar of doing something Tolkien-like while not doing Tolkien is Stephen King.
Huh. Like the Dark Tower, or
Thinking of the Dark Tower, but you think about how the Randall Flagg character and how all these books are sort of like, it's not that every book he's ever written is interrelated, but he aims for certain scopes, and the Dark Tower being a sort of like theoretical key point right there, and the Randall Flagg character as well, the Man in Black, the whole thing, whether it's The Stand, which is perhaps his most self-consciously big epic story, is not a mock European story. It's a very American story.
Yeah.
And you do have a central location of it, Las Vegas, of course, in The Stand, where that character is, and his own equivalent to the Barad-dûr is essentially there, and all that. But because it's not portrayed in a ye olden times fantasy, it's portrayed in a post-nuclear setting, unlike Terry Brooks, in his own post-nuclear setting, where it's something that it's a very American version of the story. And King himself is very open about the fact that he very much is a Tolkien fan. It's just not something he hides. And I think this is one reason why to look at it sort of like there is a way to tell the kind of good versus evil big epic thing, whether or not you buy into it, of course. I mean, if I remember right, King himself is also Catholic, so hey, connections. Or at least was at a time. So that to me is an example of how that story you can aim on that level and do it successfully by not trying to just simply rewrite Tolkien again. So doing it there. That's another way to look at it, I suppose. I've sort of monopolized the conversation here for a bit. Jared, is there anything you want to more bring up, not necessarily about your own work, feel free, but other thoughts you might have about, people sort of, whether it's writers you like or admire, or sort of working against these models, or have thought about it? Anyone in particular?
The obvious first answer that comes to mind is Ursula K. Le Guin, who is very openly influenced by Tolkien, but right after that comes out, she writes Earthsea, which is extremely un-Tolkien-like, despite she even name drops Kingsfoil in it, which I always loved when I was a kid. I was like, no, I still do. Where even though she later says that she was writing those first 3 books as, quote, an honorary man, unquote, but she's still very interested in things that are on the fringe of a Tolkien-esque fantasy. I know Ged is a special boy, but he's not always the center of the story. And the second book in that first trilogy was a huge influence on the West Passage, The Tombs of Atuan, which is about a group of priestesses in the middle of the desert, and it has no cosmic stakes. There's no conflict between good and evil. It's just this one girl doing housework until her life changes in really drastic ways. And I love that kind of thing, where it's somebody who's not at the center. She's briefly the center of the story at the very end of the grand narrative overall, because it kind of intrudes on her life, but otherwise she's just kind of there eating lentils or whatever, and which I love. I think that's so great. I love that kind of vibe where you're not the chosen one. Maybe you know the chosen one, but you're just kind of there while other stuff is going on. So yeah, there's her. I mean, you already brought up Marlon James. I also think of people like John Crowley, who's writing fantasy that is... I don't know what his views on Tolkien are at all, but it has nothing to do with Tolkien. He's just... It's another very American... fantasy series, the Egypt cycle. I love it so much. I'm in the middle of my annual reread right now, actually.
Oh, nice.
Yeah,
good choice.
I love it. So even though a lot of it is still centered on Europe and John Dee and Hermetic magicians in the 17th, 16th, 17th centuries, it still is more regarding them as an object of fascination. And it's not we got to talk about this because you have to be in a European setting for fantasy to work. It's just we're in America. We're still interested in other stuff.
Right.
And he's also getting into things like fundamentalist Christianity, which is distinctly American fundamentalist Christianity, not anywhere else, and bringing that up in almost an urban fantasy kind of way. So I love that kind of thing too.
Yeah, I think you raise a good point that the further we get away from Tolkien, the more fantasy becomes less sort of hidebound to the idea, as was so often the case, of where everything seemed to be referring back to, particularly English medievalist point of view, because everything was sort of so centered around that. That was something that I found at the exhibition the other year, the one at Marquette that I was able to attend, that looked at the various manuscripts, how it spent a lot of time sort of setting up how the Victorian era ended up sort of valorizing this particular thing in terms of historical study and reproduction about our ye olde English heritage and things like that, and sort of like in its more like, sort of like you could say standardized education, the ability to spread certain texts around, the idea sort of like, okay, here are the stories to tell type thing, which ones are being valorized, which ones are being sort of like newly centered in, and how that's done. That's something that Tolkien, responded to, was shaped by. And that's something that you look at it now, it's sort of like, because if you're thinking about, basically writing, I don't want to say Tolkienian stories today, but rather have that same creative impulse. I mean, you could be looking at everything from like, all the anime series that you're watching on Crunchyroll to whatever RPGs in all sorts of different directions, which could include Dungeons and Dragons, which obviously is derived from that sort of thing, but can include many other things. And, it's different palettes. By default, we see different results. And I think that's all to the good, obviously. More could be said. But Oriana, are there any thoughts you want to bring in as we're sort of like keeping on the time, observations, recommendations, things you'd like to suggest yourself?
Yeah, I feel like one piece of this we haven't talked about is sort of market forces and capitalism.
Yeah, by all means, please, talk away. It's actually less like market forces, quote unquote, and more the type of people who are in charge of publishing and were in charge when Tolkien was alive and writing Lord of the Rings, the type of people who are, in charge of publishing now, and how, in kind of all entertainment media, whether it's publishing or TV or film, the executives just always want more of the successful thing. And it is almost a miracle that we managed to free ourselves from the, very Tolkienian Terry Brooks sort of, who is the Xanth guy? Piers Anthony, yeah. The David Eddings, like all of that stuff. I do wonder how many people wrote amazing Ursula K. Le Guin or N.K. Jemisin-esque books back in the day and didn't get published. It's amazing that Ursula herself we're on a first name basis.
Yeah.
No, it's amazing that she managed to break through. That's like wonderful, but total miracle. And we can't really, it's always interesting to stop and think like, oh shit, like there probably were just thousands of people writing incredible things that we'll never get to see because it wasn't Shannara, it wasn't, Shannara. No, I'm so sorry.
I know, I hate that.
I refuse. I'm so sorry.
Yeah. No, I think out of curiosity in preparation for this episode, I went back and looked at the Hugo Award winners for Best Novel for the last, I guess, 51 years at this point.
Wow.
And the winners and nominees are almost all not Tolkienian fantasy. There's a ton of extremely interesting stuff happening there, but it's not the bestsellers. It's not when you think of fantasy literature, I think the popular image is still the elves and the dwarves and the Dark Lord and all that kind of thing. Right. But for a very, very long time, the stuff that fantasy writers themselves love has been literally anything else.
Yeah.
They're as bored with it as we are, no, in a way.
So it's, even though what is selling heavily is probably still the more, I guess, like safer stuff, or like the Brandon Sanderson type thing, which I haven't read. I haven't
Terry
read.
Goodkind, hey.
Yeah, so I can't make fun of these people as much as I want to, because I don't know.
Right. Yeah.
But that very capital letters world building trademark type thing that is still what people think fantasy is the one that is selling very well. And Brandon Sanderson is basically a corporation at this point. But the stuff that is getting love from the people who really love fantasy is totally different.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, time has come to talk about what our next episode will be about. The choice of topic has come around to Oriana. What are we going to talk about next time?
Well, given all this news about Andy Serkis's new directorial project, who is Aragorn? What is his deal? What is his function? How is he, adaptations? Let's just talk Aragorn, Strider, man of many names.
A fine choice. Yeah, the one that for whom in almost any other type of fantasy beforehand would have been the hero, but is not. So there is something there, but what does it all mean?
A lesson a lot of people didn't learn.
I know, right?
No, they did not. We can talk about that next time too, though. So that'll be good. So,
speaking of resisting Tolkien,
yeah,
right?
Boy, that can be the follow-on. So let's see. So, all right. So that'll be what we get to in a month's time, and we're looking forward to it. So we're going to wrap up here. So once again, West Passage. Again, by the time this episode drops, publication will be about 2 weeks away, if I remember right. The episode will things like that. So again, still time to get your pre-orders in. And remember, ignore a certain company based out of Washington State. We're sorry. Order from your local bookstore. Order from bookshop.org.
Yeah, I will mention this is only going to be relevant for a couple of weeks after the episode comes up. But if you are in the Seattle area, there will be a launch event at Third Place Books in Ravenna on July 17th at, I think, 7 p.m. You can look on their site for more information, and we can obviously link it in the show notes. But if you're in the area, it would be great for you to come out and see me in conversation with somebody, which is surreal.
He's in conversation
in
with.
Conversation
oh my God.
with. Yeah. So,
as someone who's going to be doing the In Conversation with a completely different author at the start of August,
that's
I get
right.
that. Yeah, so that is totally separate. It's my friend Zach Schoenfeld on his Nick Cage book. It's going to be fantastic, but I'll throw in a quick link to that. But separate deal. Go to Jared's thing. That's the more important thing. If you're in the area, you happen to be in Seattle and all that, do that. That will be fantastic. We'd love to hear some reports. We'd love to see photos. Hey, so please attend if you can. And I'm sure there will be more events and things coming out. And who knows what reviews may appear. Every so often now I'm getting these mail outs from things like Bookshop, whatever. They're like, new pushes. Like, do I see a certain cover? Is a certain cover there yet? Will it be there? Let's cross our fingers. That would be kind of great. We're all hoping for it. So, but again, thank you all very much for listening. We hope you enjoyed our discussion, and we will see you all next time. So just once again, as always, megaphonic.fm/By-The-Bywater is where to find us, our episode guide and so forth. Our social media, main one is on Blue Sky. We're also all available individually there and elsewhere. Follow us as you see fit. Consider joining up the Megaphonic Patreon. That will let you come to our Discord, and you can keep up with all our jokes, memes, comments, and other things, including our various reactions to everything that we were talking about in the news section. That was many and varied, and we're all like, and all that. And we'll keep going for some time to come. Otherwise, thank you again for listening. Much appreciated. We will talk to you next time. Until then.